who is Meghan Adams. Now Meghan's doing a PhD on suicides among returned men between the wars. She has been working for the Australian War Memorial, and she's now working as an historian with Veterans Affairs in Canberra. And she'll be talking to us about VADs, the ARC and the ACF. Meghan.
Just this downwards. Sorry, everyone. All right. Well, good morning. It's really wonderful to be here today. I'm really excited to be able to come and share a little bit more with you all about the research that went into my chapter, and of course to be doing that in the company of the other wonderful contributors here today. Before we begin, I'd like to say that I really think that In the Fight brings something pretty unique to the field of Australian military history, and I think it's done a fantastic job at really illuminating different aspects of Australia's Second World War experience that have not previously been well understood. So while the focus of the book, as we know, is on Australians in the war in Burma, the focus of my chapter is actually on the island nation of Ceylon, also known as Sri Lanka. And it looks at the experiences of Australian volunteers who were working there during the Second World War to support Allied operations. I was very excited when Andrew and Daryl approached me to contribute this chapter, but I knew it was going to be a bit of a journey of research discoveries for me. I'd been to Sri Lanka before, and like many of you, was aware of the historical and geographical significance of this place. But no stories of Australian service immediately came to my mind when I thought about this. So I didn't know what I would find when I embarked on this research journey, but over the course of the months of research which followed, I uncovered some really remarkable individuals and some fascinating tales about service, dedication, love, fear, and even a few about animals, which we all love. So I'd like to share some of those with you all today. But before we begin, I might just mention that you're probably thinking, well, why Ceylon? Why are we talking about Ceylon in a book that's about the war in Burma? So for that, I will provide a little bit of context for you all. So we know that Ceylon was an important stopover location during the First and Second World Wars for troops moving through to different areas of the conflict. But during the Second World War, it began to take on a pretty significant strategic role as well. So it retained that importance in connecting Britain and its convoys with other empire nations, but it was Japan's invasion of Malaya at the end of 1941 that really transformed Ceylon into a key Allied military base. As we know, that invasion later resulted in the fall of Singapore, and other nations fell soon after. This resulted in continued fighting throughout Southeast Asia and in Burma, of course. And so by this stage, Ceylon actually finds itself surrounded by hostile, or perhaps soon to be hostile, nations. And so there's a rush to garrison the island. There was a need to hold it to ensure that the Allies could maintain control over the Indian Ocean, but also Allied forces could not afford to lose another key base in a war that was becoming increasingly devastating by the day. And around this time as well, we have a number of Australian units that are returning from the Middle East, and these were initially sanctioned to go to Burma to fight against the Japanese forces there, but they were instead sent to Ceylon to reinforce the island in case Japanese forces decided to attack there as well. So by about March of 1942, we have a whole bunch of different Allied units, Australian, British, Indian, all stationed in Ceylon where they're helping to support the war in the East. But of course their efforts would not have been possible without the support of a number of volunteers, among the many Australians, who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to support these people. And so my chapter begins with the story of 19 voluntary aides that were posted to Ceylon in October of 1941. And you can see them there, the ladies on the ship up in the top corner. Now these women were members of voluntary aid detachments, which have their roots in the First World War and the Red Cross. So during the First World War, these women worked as nursing orderlies both in and outside of Australia, and they continued this work during the interwar period, also working in convalescent homes and that kind of thing. They were particularly valuable after the outbreak of the Second World War because they helped to relieve some of the manpower shortages that were experienced early on by serving in hospitals and taking on those additional roles. But these women were not initially permitted to serve outside of Australia. So when these 19 voluntary aides were sent to Ceylon, they were among the first within their organisation to do their work outside of Australia during the Second World War. Now on arrival in Colombo, they were posted to the 2nd 12th Australian General Hospital at a place called Wellasara, which is just north of Colombo. And there they undertook clerical duties as well as the work of dental and nursing orderlies. And for the first sort of short period of their service, it was fairly routine work during this time. They're treating troops that were disembarked from hospital and troop ships at Colombo, and things were fairly quiet. And it was a really exciting opportunity for a lot of these women, especially those who hadn't travelled extensively before, but it was also different and challenging in a lot of ways. And the story of one of the voluntary aides, Rosalind Bowman, comes to my mind when I think about this. Rosalind gave her occupation as a socialite before entering the voluntary aides, and she wrote a letter home to her family to tell them about some of the wildlife that they had encountered in Ceylon. And she said, "Killing snakes is all in a day's work for voluntary aides stationed in the east. We were terrified of the snakes at first, but as the natives refused to kill them because of the belief that the reptiles might be their reincarnated ancestors, we had to dispose of the horrible creatures as best we could. Much to our disgust, the snakes formed a great attachment to the palm leaf huts in which we were quartered adjoining the hospital, and we found them in the roof, on beds, chairs, and tables. I must have killed on average 1 snake a day. The heat was unbearable, but we were kept so busy we seldom had a minute to ourselves. It was grand work, and we loved it." Now, snakes and heat were only among the more minor challenges for voluntary aides in Ceylon. As we spoke about earlier, the invasion of Malaya actually increased their workload significantly in the months which followed. They began treating casualties from other theatres of war that were coming through to Ceylon, treating refugees from, that were fleeing from different war zones, and also treated survivors from the British ships Prince of Wales and Repulse. But this was not the end of the war story in Ceylon. They actually were attacked directly by Japanese forces in April of 1942 in what has become known as the Easter Sunday Raids, Now, none of the hospital staff or voluntary aides were injured during these attacks, but it was a reminder for them that they were in the thick of it and in an active war zone. At the end of 1942, the hospital facilities were actually taken over by the 50th Indian General Hospital, and so the voluntary aides were sent back home, arriving in Australia in early 1943. But their departure was not the end of Australian volunteer involvement in Ceylon. In fact, a number of other volunteers remained behind to assist Allied personnel who were serving in or transiting through Ceylon. And among them, as you might imagine, was the Australian Red Cross, which had been there from the early days of the war. And they played a really significant role in providing comforts and convalescent facilities, and of course in ensuring the availability of vital supplies to hospitals and ships. And there were many Australians there, but among them, the story of Gladys Collins particularly stood out to me. Now, Gladys Collins initially came to Ceylon as one of the voluntary aides in 1941, and later ended up joining the Red Cross. And the story goes that Gladys was on leave one day in Colombo, just enjoying herself, when she saw a number of wounded being disembarked from ships. And the Red Cross workers who were there trying to assist them, provide refreshments, anything that they might have needed, were quite overwhelmed by the amount of people that were coming off this ship. So Gladys leapt into action, doing whatever she could to help organise operations and assist the Red Cross workers. And on this day, her actions were actually witnessed by the Assistant Commissioner of the Red Cross, a man named Norman Wilkinson, who was so impressed by her work that he actually approached the Army to allow Gladys to join the Red Cross instead. And this request was eventually granted. Gladys joined the Red Cross, and during her time with the organisation, she worked with a lot of vigour and determination. And one of the things that Gladys was particularly well known for was for taking the little Red Cross launch out into Colombo Harbour, where she would climb aboard ships to offer supplies and comforts to anybody on board, and even to offer getting different souvenirs for people who weren't able to come ashore to Colombo. And she became a bit of an icon for this work and earned herself the nickname of Harbour Gladys. And one of the Australian newspapers reported a little bit on the work that she was doing, and they said that when seamen and torpedoed merchantmen who have been picked up by steamers arrive by small boats, Harbour Gladys is down like a shot to see that they are completely equipped with clothes and comforts from our stores. Now, the kind of work that Gladys Collins was doing was fairly typical of what you expect from the Red Cross in providing comforts and that kind of thing to troops. But they also operated a convalescent home in Colombo, which was known as Ottery. And this was a really wonderful place. I believe it was a former tea plantation, and they had tennis courts, swimming pool, all sorts of lovely facilities. And this played a really important role in helping to ease pressure on hospitals in Ceylon, but also offered a lovely place of respite for recovering troops. But the Red Cross also undertook some more unusual work during their time in Ceylon. And this included, on one occasion, helping to search for a missing ship's cat that had been left behind on a life raft when some shipwrecked sailors were brought ashore. The shipwrecked sailors wanted them to go and find their missing cat, so they did. The cat was later located and brought ashore, still clinging to the life raft that it had previously been left on. And as one newspaper reported, the cat was somewhat pleased himself, having used up his spare lives at such an alarming rate. Now, of course, the Australian Red Cross Society was among the most well-known of the voluntary organisations working in Ceylon, but it was not the only one. The Australian Comforts Fund, which is also very well known for its wartime work, also worked alongside the Australian Red Cross in Ceylon. They, of course, operated in a number of other theatres of war, but their work was eventually extended to Ceylon to help support the hospital and in anticipation of increasing troop numbers there. And during this time, they, like the Red Cross, worked very hard to supply comforts and amenities to the hospital, and even ended up opening their own rest home in the centre of Colombo. And there, troops could access writing materials, sporting equipment, games, and even tea, all courtesy of the Australian Comforts Fund. But aside from this, they also played an important logistical role in distributing comforts and necessities on the island and to ships that were passing through. And in Colombo, the ACF operations were overseen by a man named Harold Hovendine, who you can see down there in the corner. And he was himself a veteran of the First World War. By the time he joined the Australian Comforts Fund, he was already very well known for his advocacy work for legacy and also ex-services organisations during the interwar period. And so when he was selected for Commissioner of the Australian Comforts Fund, he was clearly an excellent choice. So he served in the Middle East, in Greece, Italy, and then eventually Ceylon. And throughout this time, he remained a passionate advocate for the work of the ACF. And he gave a quote to a newspaper at one point, which I thought really summed up the significance of voluntary organisations and what they were doing for troops. And he said that troops were just grown-up kids after all. They think of the people who provided the parcels and know that they have someone fighting for them back there. And so in this way, we can see that the work of the ACF sort of met the physical needs of troops, but it also reminded them that they had the support of their homeland behind them. In Colombo as well, ACF work was assisted by the British branch of the Young Women's Christian Association, who also took valuable work across the island. And although this is not an Australian unit, they still had Australians working for it, which you'll see is a bit of a theme in this book, Australians popping up everywhere. And one of the Australian women serving with this unit was a lady named Mary Mears. Now, Mary Mears was a volunteer during the First World War and had worked for the Red Cross during the interwar period. And much like Harold Hovendine, she had an excellent reputation for her advocacy work for veterans, and was often referred to as a friend to diggers. But when the Second World War broke out, Mary Mears was unfortunately too old to undertake Red Cross work overseas. But she was determined that she would do her bit and did not let this stop her. So she instead joined the Young Women's Christian Association, which was resulting in a posting over to Ceylon. And in Ceylon, Mary Mears helped to establish and run the jointly operated Young Women's Christian Association and Australian Comforts Fund rest homes, and also helped with the distribution of supplies and comforts across the island. After the war, Mary Mears helped to work with philanthropic organisations across India and Burma, where she was assisting servicemen and POWs with whatever they might have needed. On her return to Australia, she continued her work with ex-service organisations and the Red Cross, and was eventually made OBE. And so for Mary Mears, you can see that her life was one that was dedicated to the service of others. So just to wrap up, these are just some of the stories that I discovered while putting together my chapter, Being the Fight. And as you can see, there are many Australians working in all sorts of areas to support the war effort. And although these people were not necessarily at the forefront of the fighting or in the most active war zone, they nonetheless made a significant contribution to the war effort. They helped to alleviate the suffering of those serving far from home. They provided comfort, companionship, and necessities. But on a broader level, they helped to provide cross-empire support networks and to maintain logistical efficiency, thereby ensuring the troops were well rested and ready to serve. So whether it was servicing troop ships and hospitals, gathering vital supplies, providing cigarettes, socks, and meals, or even rescuing lost cats, Australian volunteers in Ceylon had a profound impact at all levels. And as the title of my chapter indicates, I believe that this is earned them a very proud place in the history of Australia in the Second World War. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Megan, and thank you to all three speakers for superbly keeping to time. Very impressive. Now,